One of the essential changes from Marx to Lenin's time was the emergence of Marxism as a mass movement. This teaching will trace Lenin's reception and prosecution of the crisis of Marxism, and in particular, his recovery of Marx through the critique of Marxism. And with that, please welcome Danny.
Am I on? Yeah. Just before I begin, my name is Danny. I'm a member of Platypus. I'm part of the Philadelphia chapter, but I also was part of the Houston chapter as well. And just to give an idea of where this teaching came in, I did a teaching that was sort of about why I joined Platypus, which was called How to Read Das Kapital. And that's kind of a strange argument to say why I went and then joined this organization. And it was kind of about how I felt that Capital had become a kind of book that looked like economics to people, and that it kind of reflected a kind of liquidation of the left, that it kind of the categories came to look like economics. And when I was doing that, I started to think, you know, what does Lenin have to say about Capital? I had interviewed a Marxist economist, this guy, Michael Roberts, and he said, well, the Second International didn't know this about Capital. And I was kind of like, why don't I go and read Lenin on this? And in the process of kind of thinking about Lenin, I thought, well, Lenin probably knows Das Kapital better than I ever did in my entire life or ever will. And yet, well, he can quote it like the back of his hand. He seemed to be more concerned with something different at the time. And that's what kind of led me to what almost looks like a redundant title. Maybe the whole proof of the teaching will be this is a kind of misdirect, meaning to be a Marxist means to critique Marxism as it is. So now I'll get into it. If you can see, I'm not reading all of this. This is 30 pages, meaning I would like for people to comment, obviously be a little polite, like raise your hand so I know, like don't jump in and go, you're a traitor or something like that. But if you can at least, so I can finish the sentence I'm on, and then I'd be happy to, because I'm already expecting that people will start saying things kind of, and I don't know if we have microphones, but I can hear you and I'll repeat you. We have microphones, okay. So here's the beginning of it. It may sound ironic, but what is frequently forgotten is Lenin's Marxism. Leninism has famously been described as Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. You might know where that's from. This frequently means either that Marx did not face the wrath of finance and war, or that Marx never took power. Sometimes it even means that Lenin is not a Eurocentric Marxist. In one sense, all of this is fine, but that still doesn't answer what it would mean to be a Marxist. Does it mean to be against your own country in war? Why? And even so, how does one come to that view? In the Communist Manifesto, when Marx and Engels talk about bourgeois society and its crisis, so they have the image of the sorcerer's apprentice that everybody in this audience knows, they are also giving an account of themselves as Marxists. History had become, and had not yet been, the history of class struggles. Quote, the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class, and yet the members of the middle class who desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat, Marx and Engels were talking about themselves. They lived in a society where the past dominated the present, a world where all that solid melts into air, all that holy is profane, a world filled with the private system, a world haunted by the specter of communism. Marx and Engels were talking about the necessity of Marxism. It had become necessary to give a critique of socialism because of its own inability to realize itself. Marx's critique of political economy, and so this kind of goes back into this earlier teaching I did, distilled the wisdom of the critical recognition of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat after 1848. And if you don't believe me, Lenin said only a Philistine would fail to realize this upon reading Das Kapital. So I take his authority here on that. Marxism was then a method that was received by the Second International as the materialist conception of history. Quote, in fact, the materialist study of history is of course subject to the very laws of historical motion that it itself lays down, writes Franz Mehring. It is the product of historical development. Historical materialism is a historical result. It could not have been imagined in any earlier period by even the most brilliant mind, or 70 Marxes, this is what Lenin likes to say. The materialist conception of history was necessitated by capitalism and was a conception of prehistory, or a world that still moves through the contradiction of forces and relations of production. Capitalism was supposed to be the last of these stages. Marxism, therefore, was a problem, and it knew itself to be so. The study of history, then, was not supposed to be, and this is Karl Kautsky, used as a permanent chart for the pilot of the political vessel, but rather as a sounding lead, as a means of learning the channel one is in and finding their way in it. The only way to understand phenomena is to learn how it was formed, and that went for Marxism itself. Why did it exist? One's own consciousness, this is Marx, must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflicting existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production. So that's Marx, not just talking about you, he's talking about himself. Okay, so Lenin receives this then, right? He's a young radical in the Second International. Lenin liked to quote Engels' dictum that Marxism was not a dogma, but it was a guide to action. But when Lenin explained what that meant, he wrote that it was dialectics, the doctrine of historical development, all embracing and full of contradictions. In a world that confronts our own activity as estranged, Marxism was therefore the self-consciousness of capital, the self-consciousness of the estranged position. This is why Marx liked Proudhon. He was like brilliantly estranged. The development of Marxism, therefore, was not concerned with the descriptive deepening of the world, but about the self-consciousness of the problem as expressed in its highest form, Marxism. This is clear in one of Lenin's earliest works. Quote, this is from 1894, "The gigantic step forward taken by Marx consisted precisely in that he discarded all these arguments about society and progress in general and produced a scientific analysis of one society and of one progress, capitalist. All progress, therefore, becomes progress in capitalism and therefore contradictory." That goes for Marxism as well. Therefore, one doesn't have to be the Congress for Cultural Freedom, this was like the CIA's thing in the 60s, or some kind of propaganda think tank to get a distortion of Marxism. It followed from the very material conditions that it is critiquing, that it itself is part of. Marxism had always had the possibility of liquidating back into liberalism, into a kind of eclectic combination of German idealism and French communism and British political economy, and yada, yada, yada. For these were only the component parts of Marxism that only made sense in their crisis and pointing beyond themselves. So Marx will talk about like, oh, the German, I'm not going to butcher the German language in front of a whole audience right now, but it's like the ich equals ich is like talking about equality in France. It's like talking about production for mead in England. He's saying the crisis of all of them is reverberating across the continent. Marxism could always become affirmative and apologetic of transformations of capitalism precisely in being correct, precisely in predicting that economic recession. We're right, it's like you're apologizing for it. The phrase, a lag in consciousness, if you know your Second International stuff, was a kind of slogan to discipline yourself to the materialist dialectic, right? Submit yourself to the materialist dialectic, says Adorno in 1930-something. Marxism, which was the ideology of the proletariat, that's Lenin's quote right there, was as much a part of the superstructure as any other bourgeois ideology. This therefore points towards the understanding of Lenin's materialism. When Lenin speaks of Marx's materialism, he describes it as the consistent continuation and extension of materialism into the domain of social phenomena. It consummates the highest development of bourgeois thought because capitalism consummates the highest development of bourgeois society in crisis. And so here would be the contradiction. Bourgeois society comes to reflect industrial production. Industrial production is set in motion, it undermines bourgeois social relations, and yet it's also reproduced through the same process, right? The capitalist mode of commodity production as opposed to just commodity production. So the materialism is not that Marx is like, yeah, I'm Duns Scotus, I'm down with materialism, but that the materialism reflects a transitory period. It itself is a crisis to overcome. The point is to overcome historical materialism. So, to quote our friend Richard Rubin, Platypus member Richard Rubin, Marxism is the highest form of bourgeois consciousness precisely because it's self-consciousness of bourgeois society in crisis. So this is there from Lenin when he's the young man. So writing against Peter Struve, and this is when Peter Struve called himself a Marxist. Later he would be like a liberal. Lenin wrote that the objectivist, this is not the Ayn Rand objectivism, the objectivist speaks of the necessity of a given historical process. The materialist gives an exact picture, the given social economic formation, and of the antagonistic relations to which it gives rise. When demonstrating the necessity for a given series of facts, the objectivist always runs the risk of becoming an apologist for the facts. The materialist discloses the class contradictions, and in so doing defines his standpoint. And this is the bolded part in my notes. Materialism includes partisanship and enjoins the direct and open adoption of the standpoint of a definite social group in any assessment of events. Or in a letter that Lenin wrote, he says, he's talking about somebody, and he goes, oh, they drown out the class struggle in rows of figures. Like, they have all this awesome data. I have no idea what's happening in it. So thus, for Lenin, to be a Marxist meant to critique Marxism, meaning Marxism was part of the it was as much a part of capitalism as the cotton bales and the electric telegraph, and so required its critique in order to actually recover Marxism. So for Lenin, one cannot develop new views other than through polemics. This is why he's like polemicizing all the time. They were essential for the development of Marxism. The Herostratian character of the most ordinary literary work of Edward Bernstein, who doesn't really even say much new, was simply that it gave form to the Marxist liquidation of Marxism, and thus allowed a Marxist critique of Marxism. So Rosa Luxemburg shares the same thing, meaning he's literally giving form to how Marxism could liquidate itself. And that's why Rosa Luxemburg's like, thank God for Bernstein. And likewise, Lenin with the Narodniks, I'll talk about this in a second, they kind of are literally giving a form to understanding the concrete totality of things. So to paraphrase a description of our friend Hegel by Rudolf Heim, Lenin tied to his triumphal chariot every view he defeated. They all became moments in Lenin's political chain. Unlike Hegel's system, which was the absolute philosophy because it built itself immanently out of the partial truths of the history of philosophy, right? I'm going to transcend Spinoza, I'm going to transcend Kant, blah, 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 consummating itself as the self-certainty and therefore truth of all the other systems of philosophy, Lenin brought all of the history of Marxism and its various tendencies to bear as determining his guide to action in order to relegate this system, which has come to be known as Marxism-Leninism, quote unquote, to where it belongs, prehistory. The very development of Marxism was the work of the proletariat in its struggle for emancipation. Literally, the new symptoms that we hopefully can get into some of the discussion were produced out of a proletariat stricken with Marxism. Thus, Lenin would say, this is 1914, a worker who took an anythingtarian attitude towards the history of his own movement could not be class consciousness. So let me say a little bit more, but I see some furrowed brows, so I think people have some things to say. Lenin's whole political life was the deepening of the crisis of Marxism. As a young revolutionary, Marxism was not just something received, but something Lenin had to learn through the critique of Marxism. According to Lenin, Marxism as a trend began to spread in the 1890s, merging with the social democratic trend initiated in Western Europe very much earlier by the emancipation of labor. I think he's more talking about Russia here. So Marxism became omnipotent because it not only spread, but also capitalism was spreading, meaning the conditions that made it a possible way of explaining the world. Marx's doctrine gained a complete victory and began to spread. The dialectics of history were such that the theoretical victory of Marxism, this is Lenin, compelled its enemies to disguise themselves as Marxist. Liberalism, rotten within, tried to revive itself in the form of social opportunism. So I just want to stop there and see if there's any thoughts, comments so far about the kind of idea. Chairs breaking, I don't know. All right, so I think once I get into it, I'll start to kind of make the case of how Marxism is producing opportunism. So the earlier form of neurodism in Russia of a Nikolai Chernyshevsky was when democracy and socialism were undivided, quoting Lenin. But they started to fray in the 1880s. There were like doctrinaire and critical neurodniks. At the time, Lenin was actually kind of aligning with critical Marxists against the neurodniks. That seemed to be the bigger problem at the time. And he has a cute letter to his mother and his sister where he goes, I know they're critical, but like I can write for Peter Struve's journal right now. And so a lot of these early critiques, the way in which Lenin was receiving Marxism was that he was critiquing petty bourgeois socialism. So if you know some of these works, he has one, Our Native Sismondies, right, economic romanticism, that this old kind of 1820s early socialism is kind of repeating itself in Russia in the form of the Narodniks and things like people's production, the Nevolia, these kind of things. And so Lenin was like, well, we've learned from Marx, this is petty bourgeois socialism. But Lenin points out something. He goes, bourgeois society is rotting. That is the Narodnik idea. It is worth emphasizing that this is the starting point of the Marxists. I mean, the kind of petty bourgeois socialist standpoint and the Marxist standpoint kind of have the same starting standpoint. Like, this is all shit, this is crap, something's wrong, right? It's the discontents with the world. The difference being that the Narodniks kind of treated it as, there's all sorts of different ways in which they would explain it, but they would treat it as tricksters. It's like tricksters got into the economy. Maybe people are lending to people, they're cheating, all sorts of things. Maybe other fun ideas we can talk about later, but and Lenin's like, no, there's a certain necessity. But the value of it was that the Narodniks were kind of like Proudhon. So if you know your like Marx-Proudhon polemics, Proudhon famously, and I saw this at Occupy like many years ago, people were like, property is theft, right? You remember this? That's a Proudhon slogan, and Marx is like, that's a contradiction. Property, theft presupposes property. There's kind of no theft in nature. It's might makes right. It's like me versus one of you in the audience, and probably you would win, and that's that. Possession, it's not property. And, Marx's point was that Proudhon nonetheless was reflecting a contradiction. And so Lenin kind of does the same thing with the Narodniks at this kind of early period. This is how he's receiving Marxism. And they also had an idea that like capitalism was a Western thing, and it was being imported from abroad, and it's like kind of evil and stuff. And what Lenin does, and these are things like the development of capitalism in Russia or economic romanticism, is he's kind of getting the way in which capitalism is appearing in a different form. And that's actually giving form to what he could critique. And that would be a condition for the later development of Marxism. So to quote Lenin, Marx in Das Kapital repeatedly stressed that the point that capital first subordinates production as it finds it and only subsequently transforms it technically, the attitude of Narodnism towards the West and towards its influence upon Russia was determined, of course, not by the fact that it seized upon this or that idea coming from the West, like get rich or be greedy, but by the small producer's conditions of life. He saw that he was up against large-scale capitalism, which was borrowing West European technique, and oppressed by it, built up naive theories which explained capitalism by politics instead of capitalist politics by capitalist economy, and which declared large-scale capitalism to be something alien to Russia, introduced from without. Now, the later kind of critical Narodniks, they kind of pick and choose some of Marx's capital. We like when Marx talks about how the system collapses, because we want to say, don't bring that here. We want this alternative path of development. And Lenin's response to them is to say, well, contradiction is not an impossibility. And actually, he says it in German, and I'm not going to, again, try to repeat this in front of the room. But he basically says there's a difference between a contradiction and an absurdity. But more importantly, from a Marxist standpoint, a contradiction is not just like, I gotcha, you're wrong, your computer program collapses, but rather that it testifies to the historical transience of capitalism, that it's pointing towards a higher form. So it was taken, the reason they were taking a petty bourgeois standpoint is because they were saying, if you bring capitalism here, it will collapse and it's bad, we want people's production. And Lenin is saying, not only do we want this contradiction, we're going to be part of actually advancing the contradiction. And this is how Lenin's going to constantly think about what does it mean to be a Marxist against everybody else in the world who calls himself a Marxist. I think he says in State and Revolution, he's like, why is it that 99 out of 100 social democrats don't know this? Like it's like a secret trick or something like that. You know, like know the works of Marx or something like that. And for him, it's always going to be a question of Marxism concretely and what people make of it in the moment.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Just to make sure that I understand your point so far. The point so far is what the difference that Lenin makes in what he thinks Marxism is, or what his critique of Marxism is, but what also the original critique of Marxism in society is that it's a self-conscious alienation as opposed to the non-self-conscious, like a contradiction is a trick or is a failure or is not something to be worked through historically.
So I like to say self-consciousness of the estrangement. Yeah. Meaning it's not simply like, it's not the more Hegelian perspective where one can reflect on we're free and we're alienated from the freedom and don't yet know how to use it. Yeah. It's rather, you know, the term from Marx is proletarian labor. Yeah. Proletarianizing labor, labor that destroys property. It's the opposite of what John Locke would imagine. John Locke's like the first property. I picked an apple off the tree, I got property. Marx is like proletarian labor is destroying property. And there's all sorts of ways in which this manifests. It's a contradiction, yeah. It's literally, they would say contradiction of production, which not that the factory is like overworking or overheating and breaking down, but the production of the species is in crisis, right? And so the condition of Marxism, the condition of Marxism is that contradiction. It's not like Marx is just some brilliant guy who's like, I was in a library and I figured it out. He is part of this. Whenever he talks about the problem with bourgeois ideology, he's self-conscious of that. Those are the forms by which he has to think. And Lenin, like, it's my favorite quote by him when he just goes, well, you know, Marx is not talking about history in general, but capitalism. He's saying Marxism's imminent to capitalism. The abolition of capitalism is the abolition of Marxism. That's why the question, the way in which Marxism is tasking itself, is to seek its own self-abolition. I know people are familiar with it through like Korsch, Lukács, and this is probably going to be talked about tomorrow. But where did Korsch and Lukács get it from? Lenin, right? Like his whole history is just pushing on, you know, when he will say later, we'll talk about it, Karl Kautsky, what's the problem with you? You're giving a Marxist explanation for what's happening. You're not pursuing the self-contradiction.
But just to make sure I understand, sorry that
No.
like, I'm nothing if not a nerd, so I need to understand this 100%. The critique of Lenin would then be one where he critiques those Marxists who think of Marxism as something that is just an observer of the crisis of capital, not something that's produced by it, right?
Yes, so I can repeat it, basically. Yeah, I'm going to move this down because it's...
I think it already happened.
Yeah, it's your question, and I'll just make sure I'm getting this right, is that for Lenin, it's not simply a critique of people who... That Marxism is... Say it again, actually, just so...
Speaking internet? Okay, that's so weird. I'm sorry. The question was that then the Leninist critique of Marxism... Yeah? Like that. Then the Leninist critique of Marxism becomes one where Lenin critiques those Marxists who understand Marxism as an observer of the crisis, not as something that's constituted by it?
That can be part of it. I think that's fair, the way that you just formulated it. The only reason I would kind of push on it a little bit more is that, for me, Das Kapital, right, this book, and so this is going to be a callback to another teaching I did. Why did Marx write this critique of political economy? Because the socialist movement were politicizing society on the basis of political economy. They were politicizing Adam Smith. They were politicizing Ricardo. They were saying, you know why we have the right to that factory? Because Ricardo told us. And instead of that simply being true, that was an expression of contradiction. So I'm trying to say that Lenin kind of does the same thing with Marxism. That again, a whole political movement is based on Marxism. Karl Kautsky, the Pope of Marxism. They're writing letters to his mom. Oh, it's the mother of the Pope. You're the mother of the Pope of Marxism. And Lenin's like, in other words, why doesn't Lenin just write Das Kapital Part 5? Because Marxism is the way in which capitalism is manifesting in, say, World War I. So that's the point that I'm trying to get at. The only reason I wanted to add that in is, of course, even the people that Lenin is polemicizing with would also say, well, yeah, Marxism is not a description of the world. It's really a question that it's always a political contest over, are you apologizing or are you actually advancing the crisis? Yeah, that was a good question. So just to jump ahead, and this goes to the question of advancing the contradiction, later, I believe this is from 1914, 14, right before August 4th, by the way. And the reason I bring that up is that the kind of collapse of neurotism, and there was this idea in the Emancipation of Labor League that we're like transcending two different strands of neurotism, the kind of Narodniki, kind of early like people's production, and then the like Narodna Volya, kind of more like, I'm not going to say it on mic, but like, you know, doing stuff kind of thing. There was this idea that that was transcended by Marxism. But my point being here that Lenin is saying in retrospect, we can actually see how we've not only split the petty bourgeois socialist movement, but he's going to say going forward how we've actually produced new symptoms. And those symptoms in a way are not only produced out of the proletarian socialist movement, but are necessary steps that it will have to learn from. And of course, if you've read your left-wing communism, he's basically saying, we dealt with all this stuff over, you know, almost 2 decades, and a lot of people didn't, and that's what kind of they broke down upon. So in Lenin's view, the Narodnik theory of people's production, of the idealization of labor farmers, served to conceal the gulf between the proletariat, the wage workers, and the bourgeoisie. So the class struggle is being deepened by Marxism itself. So then we get this thing called economism, which is not about economics. And also none of the economists ever say, yes, I'm an economist. They go, no, I'm a Marxist, and it's slander to call me an economist. So this is something that shows up more in 1894, 1898, and it comes out of, in a sense, the kind of victory over the Narodniks. Social democracy was ideologically united, this is Lenin, and it was then that an attempt was made to achieve the same unity in practice and organization, right? So in other words, they're starting to talk about the party. This naturally raised all sorts of questions about programs and parties, and the struggle of the economists in Iskra, however, was more within Marxism. Meaning the economists were saying they seemed to place themselves on the basis of Marxism and go, oh, you guys are talking about class struggle, but then you're talking about the democratic republic. You sound like Narodniks, whereas we're Marxists. We're about the working class, the proletariat. And don't you know it's class struggle? And that this trend was actually coming out of kind of the victory over neurotism. So then this is everybody in the room's favorite footnote from What Is to Be Done. So in fact, it is no secret for anyone that 2 trends have taken form in present-day international. Incidentally, in the history of modern socialism, this is a phenomenon, perhaps unique and in a way very consoling, namely that the strife of the various trends within the socialist movement has from national become international. Formerly, the disputes between Lassalleans and Eisenachers, between Gesidists and Possiblists, between Fabians and Social Democrats, between Narodnaya Volya adherents and Social Democrats remain confined within purely national frameworks, reflecting purely national features and proceeding, as it were, on different planes. At the present time, as is now evident, the English Fabians, the French ministerialists, the German Bernsteinians, and the Russian critics all belong to the same family, all extol each other, learn from each other, and together take up arms against dogmatic Marxism. In this first really international battle with socialist opportunism, international revolutionary social democracy will perhaps become sufficiently strengthened to put an end to the political reaction that has long reigned in Europe. I mean, Lenin is saying, actually the revolution's here precisely because there's a crisis in Marxism. And he's going to just pursue this idea. Now at the time, this is before the Second Congress, this is before Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, these lines, and other people in Iskra agree with them. So at the time, Martov is he's recruiting students for Iskra, and he's going on speaking tours and giving a speech called Always in the Minority, and he says the same thing. He says, right now the crisis in Marxism is the prelude to the actual revolution. And Lenin would say this again in 1908 as well, and I'll send this to people later if they want. Okay. So the Narodniks said, the economists in response to this said that the Iskrais, this is like Lenin and Martov as like that at the time, like good, buddies, that they were abandoning the class point of view because they seemed to be talking about political liberty and they were like narodniks. Whereas Lenin's whole point is, no, you're actually adapting to a way in which Marxism has succeeded, was defeated, the St. Petersburg strikes are put down, and you're kind of using Marxism to kind of adapt to the situation. But this is why it is a myth that Lenin simply puts consciousness versus spontaneity. Rather, as he put it, and here's a nice quote, an ideologist is worthy of the name only when he precedes the spontaneous movement, points out the road, and is able of all others to solve all the theoretical, political, tactical, and organizational questions which the material elements of the movement spontaneously encounter. To say, however, that ideologists cannot divert the movement from the path determined by the interaction of the environment and elements is to ignore the simple truth that the conscious element participates in this interaction and in the determination of the path. Catholic and monarchist labor unions in Europe are also an inevitable result of the interaction of the environment and elements. And Lenin goes on to say, and so are these critics of Marxism. Meaning it's not simply like spontaneity on one side or consciousness on the other side, but even having a theory of spontaneity, which can be a very popular thing. One is playing the role of an ideologist still. They're still giving form in some question, like you're still organizing people in some manner. And so the question then for Lenin was rather, who are these people that are giving forms to these elements? I mean, they could happen in all sorts of ways. And even right there, if the world is contradictory, you could have 50 shades of Marxism, perhaps, which maybe there were at the time. And this is why this is kind of behind the, maybe famous or infamous part of Lenin. Revolutionary consciousness must come from without. It's the thing that Kautsky said in 1885, which is really the fact that the kind of contradictory world is going to be given some kind of form, some kind of misrecognition, as a party, as a Lenin, as a Kautsky, and that the question is kind of what is giving rise to these forms, what do they mean, and how does one actually advance the problem that they're ostensibly, that's producing them in the first place. So around the Second Congress, and this is when we get the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, the question of Marxism is no longer about neurotism. Actually, not even at the time, it comes back a little bit later. But rather, it's really at the question of Marxism and a crisis in Marxism. So pre-Marxian strands of socialism had to, quote, appear on the general ground of Marxism as revisionism. Revisionism then signaled the need to transform Marxism in order to preserve its revolutionary insight. Critique Marxism. Quote, only the theory of revolutionary Marxism can be the banner of the class movement of the workers, this is Lenin, and Russian social democracy must concern itself with the further development. So he's saying, of course it has to develop, but the question is how, and how do we judge it as not something that's just liquidating everything away? And implementation of this theory, and must safeguard it against the distortions and vulgarizations to which fashionable theories are so often subjected. Lenin was tasked from the beginning with the question of remaining true to the ends of Marxism, but incorporating new facts. Quote, simply to close one's eyes, this is Lenin making fun of somebody, not only to bourgeois science, but even to the most absurd doctrines, up to and including extreme obscurantism, is of course undoubtedly harmful. That is a banal commonplace. It is one thing, however, not to close one's eyes to bourgeois science by keeping watch on it and using it, but being critical towards it and refusing to surrender the integrity and definiteness of one's world's outlook. But it is another thing to give way to bourgeois science and to repeat, for example, catchwords about Marx being tendentious, which have a very definite meaning and significance. And so Lenin kind of emphasized that the Iskra faction was going to set up the situation, they mean a party, that would allow for the consistent development. Because in becoming a party, you're kind of objectifying Marxism, you're objectifying the history of the proletarian socialist movement. You're letting that object then interact with history. And thus you're raising the question of what would be necessary to transform Marxism in order to kind of preserve the end goal and not simply liquidate it away. So the party is not like a solution, like we got it, the party, there's no more problem anymore. Obviously, that didn't happen. But rather, it's a question about how it raises the necessity of the problem. So in order to do this, and I think this will be good for also some of the panels that we'll be seeing this weekend, Lenin had to separate revolutionary Marxism from opportunist distortion, and this could only be achieved on the basis of a perfectly definite program. So there are obvious reasons for a program, of course, like people understand it politically, but it's also a question about what it would mean to give an object of Marxism concretely. In other words, in the program, in how that would be interpreted, you're allowing for the question, the problem of Marxism to pose itself in practice. When it's kind of not there, it's like, I don't know, people guessing and throwing footnotes or something, or me giving some lecture on Lenin or something. It really lacks the concrete specificity that would give it a value. In this sense, Lenin is following Kautsky at the time. By seeking the program, you're establishing a self-critique of Marxism, which is what it really means to be Marxist. You know, I keep thinking like this is kind of a redundant title, which is fine. I suggested it, it's my fault kind of thing. Because in a sense, to be a Marxist would always mean to give a critique of Marxism. So maybe the redundancy says something about the present then. In the explanation of the program, Lenin explained that Marxism was the first to transform socialism from utopia into a science, but it also indicated the path that must be followed in further development and elaborating its parts. So at this time, he's very concerned with the fact that Marxism has to develop, but how is it going to be done? And so there's an example, I'm not going to read all this, but in the debates at the Second Congress, there's a whole discussion about the agrarian program. And I'll just read one quote really quickly. Lenin said that all that was needed was an issue to arise which did not quite come within the already established and customary pattern, and which called for some independent application of Marxist theory to peculiar and new social and economic relations in order for the opportunists to reveal themselves. So the basic debate was that the economists were accusing the kind of Iskarists of being like narodniks. Why are you talking about the peasants? Like, don't you know it's the workers? Didn't we just overcome this in the last year? And Lenin was like, well, they just didn't know how to use the Marxism that they learned in Word and not actually learned how to think about. And they kind of revealed themselves because, of course, you know, historically in Marxism, the peasants could be reactionary, they could be revolutionary. It's been like that in the Communist Manifesto, but we also know what happened in the 18th Brumaire. And so the mere fact that they kind of fumbled on that one question, Lenin was like, I gotcha. And then, of course, he's pursuing a polemic against Martov because he's like, so why did you align yourself with them? You know, you're supposed to be the Marxists, and now you're kind of aligning yourself with them at the Second Congress. So even simple things like that, like maybe it's boring to people to talk about agrarian program, I don't know, it could be exciting, was enough for somebody to reveal like they hadn't thought about what it would mean to think of Marxism and history up until then. So what was new then is like, okay, we've defeated the economists, we defeated the narodniks, and now we produced a new kind of opportunism, at least in Lenin's view, which was Menshevism. And now, again, like this is coming out of the victory of Marxism. Like they're also pro-party. They also are for the agrarian program. Later after 1905, we'll disagree, blah, blah, blah. But like they're like Marxists, right? And then, you know, like weren't you in exile with Martov? And we've all seen Fall of Eagles, and Martov approaches them, he goes, you remember our time, like we stood up, like, you know, talking? What is this? And so the Mensheviks have their own Marxist critique of Marxism, that they want to explain Lenin. So this is Pavel Axelrod, one of the I guess, fathers of Russian Marxism. So he says, in the West, one of the first tasks confronting the Social Democrats was to free the proletariat from the influence and tutelage of freedom-loving democratic intelligentsia. In Russia, on the other hand, it was necessary for the social and political development of the workers that the Marxists should take the initiative of putting the radical intelligentsia in touch with the proletariat and aiding the former in every way to assume revolutionary leadership over the latter. However, we look at this, there was a glaring contradiction between the subjective aims of the founders of our movement and the choice of means that history thrust upon them. Meaning, the Mensheviks are explaining Lenin as kind of the result of an overproduction of intellectuals. It's like we have all these people that are hyped up on Marxism. They really want to be Marxists. They're like really hyped up on this. They've been sent to prison that they're really hyped up on Marxism. They're trying to have the class struggle, and he's like, this is what's happening at the Congress. Trotsky says the same thing in Our Political Task because he was like a fan of Axelrod at the time. So they have their own Marxist explanation for what's happening. And Axelrod accuses Lenin of Jacobinism. And Lenin's like, yes, I'm a Jacobin. That's right. I'm a Jacobin who, quote, wholly identifies himself with the organization of the proletariat, a proletariat conscious of its class interests. Several years later, like Lenin's like, you're going to call me a Jacobin, I'm going to run with it and jump off with it. We cannot conceive of the social revolution being accomplished by the proletariat without this struggle, without clear demarcation on questions of principle between the socialist mountain and the socialist Girondin prior to this revolution, and without a complete break between the opportunist petty bourgeois elements and the proletarian revolutionary elements of the new historic force during this revolution. So this crisis, both sides are pursuing it going into 1905. Okay, we've made the party has given form to this, and we're kind of going down, and now we can reflect on it. And this success is then raising a new question already going into 1905. And this is why Lenin is going after, what is the class character of the Mensheviks? Let me actually stop for a second. Any thoughts, questions? There's been a lot. I got farther into this than I thought I was going to get, because there were not questions yet. Oh, yes.
This idea that capitalism is a Western import to Russia, because I was thinking, so if we say that capitalism is a universalizing force that creates the international working class, that could be that could give reasoning to opportunism, because opportunism. You understand the question? I'm not sure. So
could you just say more about what? So I'll repeat it, and then also I'll jump off the last part. So you were asking Lenin's critique of the view that the Neuronics were saying capitalism is imported from abroad, and in a sense it was, right? It's only kind of what somebody did with that, meaning they treated it as something external, like, oh, they imported it abroad? Send it back. Like, I don't want it. Whereas like the whole point is that even, it's kind of like, what is capitalism? Right? It's like the pathology of society. It's not bourgeois society, it's bourgeois society in crisis. And so even in being interacting with a capitalist country, you're in a sense already starting to organize under capitalism. Now, you asked at the end, what if this gives rise to some kind of opportunism? And I can guess maybe where that's going, but I would like you to explain more of how you see that would.
So if we're optimistic about capitalism, that it can create the international working class, the international proletariat, that the proletariat is international because it's the product of capitalism, doesn't that give reason to an optimism about capitalism?
Well, it doesn't happen automatically, right? Meaning it's not that, wage labor is universalized. Meaning a proletariat's not really the same thing as the wage worker. And that's kind of like what Lenin is running with. Meaning I can't just be like, I'll be optimistic that it will just kind of internationally solidify. Right, that was kind of the economist. The economist would say, well, it's tactics as process. The problem with you, Lenin, is you're doing something totally undialectical and un-Marxist because you're talking about giving consciousness to things. You want to plan everything out. You're like this, like, it's fine. They would all call each other, oh, you're Jacobin, Robespierre, or something like that. But really, Lenin's whole point is, well, everybody is giving form to it, including even the economists who are saying you can't give form to it. They're explaining it. They're like, it's part of organizing the workers of, oh, we're not at that stage yet. Okay, so this is where we are. So in terms of your point, my point is, could somebody, I'm not saying you, I'm saying other people, could they superficially say, oh, we're just going to have necessarily an international proletariat because capitalism is universalizing? Sure, and of course they've made that argument, but certainly Lenin doesn't think so, and certainly Marx doesn't think so, and certainly Karl Kautsky didn't think so either.
And another question I would like to have, like you're suggesting, I'm not sure, that Lenin invented something new through critiquing Marxism as a Marxist. But in State and Revolution, he goes back to the old text, so he's creating this new thing by going back to the roots. So what do you think about that?
Hell yeah, I agree with that. That's the point, meaning like this whole teaching maybe is based on what Lenin did in State and Revolution, which is like, does he say anything new? No, and this is why I've been to all sorts of different communist reading groups. Oh, we want to know the Marxist theory of the state. Oh, here's State and Revolution. Oh, okay, first chapter, the end, blah, blah, blah. No, why is he writing that when he writes that? He's writing that because, I'm going to just skip ahead. Now we're just going to freewheel, and I'm just going to jump around the teaching. What's happening in the dual power, right? What's happening in like 1916 and 1917? The question of the state is being concretely posed. You have Marxists in power. You have the Mensheviks appear to be correct. Oh, we've had a bourgeois revolution because we have the bourgeoisie in the provisional government. They're coming out of the Fourth Duma. And we're simply taking power in the Soviets. And didn't we call for revolutionary communes in 1905? And we're doing exactly right. And you're having socialists who are like, well, you know, you're an anarchist if you want to get rid of the state, because didn't Marx say the state is the midwife of revolution and the revolutionary transformation, and the Paris Commune is the lever for the working class to emancipate itself. So what are you talking about, you know, wanting to destroy the state? I'm saying that because when Lenin is just going through Marx, he's giving an imminent dialectical critique of the history of Marxism. He is saying there was this experience. This is the way in which he talks about Marxism. He talks about it as the summing up of an experience. Not merely empirical, not like we saw facts, but summing up the general tendency of things. That experience was bequeathed to members of the Second International. I did a teaching on the Second International to try to build into this teaching. And then that question returns in 1917 precisely through the advance of Marxism. And so Marxism is regressing on its own terms. So no, the State and Revolution is not simply the Marxist theory of the state. Lenin is critiquing a contradiction in the Marxist movement. He's playing Pannekoek off of Kautsky, right? And it was posing itself at that time because it actually was a concrete problem in a way that it wasn't in 1908, right? Like I think in 1916, Lenin writes a response to Bukharin's Youth International Review, and he literally says, I'm literally going to literally study this question because it's now posing itself in a way that it hasn't prior. And he thinks even the class point of view, like this language the Marxists would say, is objectively coming out because the Mensheviks are trying to build and extend democracy, and in doing so, they have to rely on kind of the arbitrariness of the executive of the state, right? They like shut down Pravda, they like break up a funeral, you know, like this is post-July Day stuff. Mensheviks are going to Cossacks' funerals, like all sorts of little things like this are for Lenin expressions of the way in which the Mensheviks are coming over to the dictatorship of capital, this kind of language, rather than the dictatorship of the proletariat. So even something like that, which today is totally ripped out of its context and just thrown at people. Here's Lenin on the state, here's Lenin on imperialism, here's Lenin on the party, here's Lenin on science, I don't know, you know, imperial criticism or something. My whole point is I'm not going to curse, every effing thing that he says is a Marxist critique of the way in which Marxism was posing problems to itself. And so what's new, the only thing that's new is there was not Marxism in Marx's time. He didn't have to deal with that as a mass movement. Marxism changed capitalism. So I was just about to talk about the 1905 revolution. I see two hands that went up. Let me just finish this point. The 1905 revolution is not only brought about in a sense by the development of the Marxist movement, it creates a crisis in Marxism, right? Coming out of it, you have like the ultimatists, you have the liquidationists. They're all basing themselves on Marxism. And I'll read a quote later after I get these two questions where Lenin is saying, this is because the world changed, the world changed because of Marxism. This is 1905. We're not talking about 1917, 1905. And that literally created a crisis in the very thing that was changing it. Okay, so let me get, yeah, there's a question. There's also two questions.
Just another question back here. Sorry about that. You can address my question maybe at the end. I don't know if you wanted to talk about it anyway, but you emphasized a very interesting aspect about Marxism. You said that it is itself the result of a historical process, which implies that you said that it wouldn't have been possible to conceptualize history, politics, and let's say the aim of history, you know, any other time in history than at that time when Marx did. So that brings me to the question about our present. Like, what is the historical process that results in a platypus? Like, you know, because that's our animal, right? Like, what is the platypus the result of Lenin's Marxist critique of Marxism in that sense? I mean, I'm asking this in a bit of a polemical way because I want to highlight like the historical condition under which we are hosting this conference. It's, I mean, at least like 100 years after Lenin's death, right? Like that's the topic of the next couple of days. So, like, how does all that relate to the state of the left today?
So yeah, I think that's a good like proposition, in fact. In other words, if I simply say that, of course people can brush it off, especially if they might not know who I am. They're like, why are you telling me this? Go away, I don't care. So what I'm trying to demonstrate is that the way in which I'm trying to kind of give the reason that Lenin came to the formulations that he did that are now received as just like formulas, right? Like anytime there's any cruise missile shot anywhere and it hits somebody, everybody goes, turn the world war into a civil war. They just say the revolutionary defeatism line, right? Or they just start, well, Lenin said this in the State and Revolution. I was just talking about the State and Revolution theory. And what I try to demonstrate, hopefully, and I've tried to do this with Das Kapital as well, is that I can only kind of prove or demonstrate it by taking up what people say and then asking about, but kind of what could they presuppose in their critiques, right? Meaning, I know that even this title, Lenin's Marxist Critique of Marxism, is like, it reminds me of like the Holy Family, critique of critical criticism, like that I have to overemphasize it because, of course, Lenin's Marxism would not be provocative. It's like, yeah, Lenin's Marxism, it's Marxist Leninism, it's the next stage. And so in trying to get at why did he say this, and the way in which maybe that's been lost, and not lost merely intellectually, like it's a product of the collapse of organizational forms, the collapse of history, the collapse of a means of, as I was just saying, of even storing history. Yes, in my view, to me, Platypus would not make sense in the 60s. It wouldn't make sense in the 30s. It wouldn't make sense in 1917. So we were just talking about State and Revolution. What if I was in Finland in 1917? I was like, Lenin, the left is dead, Platypus. Of course that would not make any sense because there was a literal way of overcoming the defeat. So now it's one of these things where it's like the defeats are like, they're not only naturalized, but there's not even a way of reflecting on how they could point beyond themselves. And that's why even today, like the whole question of revisionism, the reason I was bringing up Luxemburg is saying, the workers, you have skin in the game because you produced an Edward Bernstein, but you also produced a Rosa Luxemburg. And so we can be objects by which the workers can reflect on. Today, if I call someone a revisionist, it actually doesn't make any sense. I don't, you know, it's like eclectic. I can't quite hold it together, and so I would rather pose it like a question, like a platypus. It's like a question mark almost. I don't know if that, you know, Andreas, you kind of put me on the spot about that, and you said you were polemicizing. So I don't have a like satisfying answer, but to me, the reason I would even be led to this, because I think I said I was led to this because I was just curious what he had to say about certain things about, I was like, why did Lenin never talk about the falling rate of profit? So let me make a digression quickly. Like, why didn't he never talk about the falling rate of profit? This is what was brought up to me in an interview. And I'm like, did he? No, he really doesn't. Because it didn't really seem like capitalism was posed as a question of the falling rate of profit, whereas when I got into Marxism, it was because, how do you explain the 2008 financial crisis? Oh, it's a falling rate of profit. Dang, don't you know, since the 70s they tried to do this, but it didn't really recover profitability. I mean, I received Marxism as like economics. Not as the imminent critique of anything. I just received it as, well, the Austrian school has their theory, the MMTers have their theory, the Fed is saying whatever, and I got this better theory. And I couldn't even really make sense of why. Like, why was I even attracted to it? Like, but I'm like, no, that's the right one, not the other one. And so I kind of say that because I think there's something similar that happens with Lenin, meaning obviously people reach for him to try to make sense of the world, but they actually can't inhabit the same kind of space by which he justified what he said. I don't know if that, there's a lot of questions, so I'm just going
to... Sorry, yeah, I have the microphone. Oh God, my voice. Danny, are we just fully going into the Q&A now? Or do you want to continue?
Yeah, I can jump through. I got way farther into this than I thought, so please go ahead, yeah.
Well, this sort of follows on from Andreas's question, so I think it might be good. So this is sort of trying to set up for the theme of the whole conference, and we'll have a few people reflecting on what the legacy of Lenin is, or how to kind of articulate the question of what Lenin means for Marxism over the next few days. And I think what I want to ask in light of your teaching is there any utility in using the language of progress in Marxism? Because that's a common way that people will try and make a claim for the importance of Lenin, is to say that he made some kind of scientific progress even in Marxism. Whereas I think one of the main things to take away for me from your presentation is that that's a very problematic language to use. And maybe to also be slightly provocative, if we can't speak about progress in Marxism, is it at all useful to talk, as Platypus does, about regression in Marxism? Can you have one without the other?
Yeah, so that's two very good questions. And so I think to answer the first one, I was trying to bring into critical relief, and that's why I mentioned it a few times. So Marxism, Leninism. And that's why the first statement was people forget that Lenin's a Marxist, right? Because people will say, no, he created a new innovation. It's Marxism, Leninism. He corrected Marx on the national question, the self-determination of nations. He has this theory of imperialism. And for me, I was just trying to say, Lenin's advance of Marxism is the deepening of Marxism as a problem, meaning you can't actually treat it as the advance in terms of propositions, of like more concrete detail of like, now we have the Marxist theory of the national question or of things having to do with science. At least that's my view, and I will be happy to try to prove it more. I mean, in terms of the question of progress and regress, so other things I was going to bring up later, there's a great line out of the Second Congress when Lenin says, the Social Democrats in every country are always returning to their 1789, to their 1848, maybe that would be here in Germany, or their 1871, or since I'm from America, 1776, right? Yeah, meaning they're always returning to like what one is doing. You know, and he also says later, Marxism doesn't call for revolution, it happens anyways. But rather you're trying to raise the necessity of the regression, right? It's the whole question about class and the whole question about, you know, capitalism's not progress or a direct line of regress either. It's rather regression through repetition. Things repeat, they regress because they kind of become opaque and occluded, kind of around the third or fourth time. And so for me, like in talking about progress and regress, it's more like there's regress in terms of less like not being able to make sense of these things anymore, or people will delude themselves into like, yes, I can make sense of it. I'm Lenin today. I am the embodiment of him. Whereas in a sense, the whole point of Marxism is mastering regression. I mean, Marxism itself is a symptom of capitalism. It is a symptom of a contradiction. And when Rosa Luxemburg says, yes, we're returning to 1848, we've progressed to 1848, or when Lenin talks about class, he has a speech he gives to students in like 1901, 1902. He says, you know, whenever we talk about one's class position, that's not like, oh, your class position's this and your class position's that. It's something that's achieved in the final analysis, meaning in returning to 1848, the whole fetish of democracy is itself kind of brought into critical relief. And this is why Luxemburg or Lenin will say, oh, the classes came out in 1905. They like come out in the open. People's class positions are revealed. You arrive at that. So going back to your question about speaking of progress and regress, on the one hand, I want to say, yes, there's regression in the sense of things becoming less clear of how to make sense of them. But then there's this other side of like, it's not like you would overcome it by, well, now we have progress. It would really mean, what would it mean to make conscious the regression? Whereas really we kind of have regression that happens under the guise of progress. And that would be something like Marxism, Leninism. Meaning like even if 1917 failed, Lenin said these things that now we stand on a higher theoretical plane. It's a very academic view of history. It's just people are saying things and we're just learning more all the time. Like I know I'm up here, I'm wearing a sweater and whatever, look at this little academic. No, I'm actually saying the academic view of history is that we're just learning all the time. We're like Voltaire, we're blasting off to the moon. We're just like, everybody's getting better. We have even, oh, did you know these people were oppressed? Now we know these people are oppressed. Whole thing. Right? So the whole, you know, I just wanted to raise that in terms of, on the one hand, what I mean, but on the other hand, it's not like Marxism would simply choose progress over regress, because the whole question would be how to overcome history, how to overcome prehistory, how to master that regression. I know there were other hands as well.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Does this work? Yeah. So I feel like maybe another kind of naive appearance of Lenin, and this is a bit provocative and polemical, but there is a genuinely little voice in my head who's just, you know, he was just a guy who was really good at winging it and then rationalizing it post facto. And, you know, maybe he was just an excellent real politician. He was really good at, you know, getting power, and he was just really good at this whole thing. And maybe he, from the inside, genuinely felt like he was processing this theory, but you know, maybe he misunderstood himself, and we are just attracted to Marxism, and therefore we want to believe that he had this capacity for a theory and a way of doing politics and doing life even that we no longer have access to. But what if he was just, you know, winging it and then saying he did it for certain reasons?
So certainly that's the popular view, right? Is that Lenin's just like maniacal, and it's ends justify the means, and he was hooked on this crazy stuff called Marxism, and he just led a coup. He's the, what is it called, the administrator class? This is the Noam Chomsky thing. He takes power, it's a coup. I mean, in my backpack I have like these biographies of Axelrod and Martov, and so they're from people who don't really like Lenin, and they just say, it's a coup, his Marxism wasn't even Marxism, it was anarchism. It's called an anarchist. Yeah, it's just Blanquism, it's crazy. So, you know, if that's one way of looking at it. And to me, simply I'd be like, well, then there's kind of no point really even talking about it. But here's the thing. Marxism did change the 20th century, whether or not we like it, right? Meaning, many years ago I was in a game theory class, has nothing to do with Marxism. My professor brought up Marxism because it haunts everything. Like even things that have nothing to do with it. How can you think of the 20th century without 1917? It was a whole thing. And so then it becomes a question of, let's say it was delusional. Let's just say Marxism is like totally whacked out, crazy, taking peyote, weird thing, okay? It would still be a question of millions of people believed it. They treated it as serious. Maybe one would have even been laughed at if I was to suggest that, oh, this is just like a crazy thing. People who were anti-Marxist had to consider Marxism seriously. Condoleezza Rice studied Lenin because she's like, oh, this was some kind of thing. that was like a serious objective thing, and I would have to learn about it. So those are like my two ideas behind that. And then for me, I'll just say one more thing, and then I see there's other questions. So sometimes people will say, well, we have the archives now, we have the objective facts, and then Lenin, whatever, he read Hegel and like whatever, and then thought he was the world spirit kind of thing. The reason I bring that up is that that's another popular way of dealing with Lenin. We can just say he's wrong. But again, that brings up a whole set of questions of the reception of Lenin, of history as a way of mediating things. And so to me, what I tried to do in this, and I would be happy to share this with anybody afterwards, is I actually tried to avoid, like, I'm not going to read Lars Lee, I'm not going to read Alan Chandler, I'm going to avoid people talking about Lenin and just try to read out of Lenin himself. And that's why everything I'm saying is how he understands what's happening. And in a certain sense, if you read like 1910 Lenin, it does kind of sound like it's like a Reddit forum or something. It's like a little like, this guy is like, the liquidators are everywhere, and it is this thing that now it kind of seems silly because 1917 happened, and that made that entire preceding history all of a sudden become world historic, whether or not people wanted to agree with it. And so it became like the beginning of Abram Asher's biography of Pavel Axelrod. He warns the reader. He goes, we're going to talk about minutia, and it's going to be very boring. And yet 20 years after these debates that happened in the 1880s and 1890s happened, an actual world-changing event happened. And in order to understand even what happened, you have to kind of take them on their own terms. Like, the reality of their ideas is more real than my existence in front of you right now. They literally changed the world. Okay.
I have a question relating to, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question a bit playing of the title. What you teased already was not the critique, but the antagonism of Leninism and Marxism. And I was wondering whether you could sort of speak about that historically, concretely, because we have in the Second International, we have Kautsky critiquing Lenin and Luxemburg, that they take the young Marx or the immature Marx, right, the early works, and then also during the duration of the 20th century, as you said, we have Marxism as Leninism becoming, well, mainly two things, the national question and the peasant question, the question how you sort of make the peasants a progressive thing, and whether you could, describe perhaps this antagonism from in the 20th century, how that develops.
Yes, so I think it goes back to two questions ago about progress and regress.
Exactly.
Right? In other words, Leninism was a way of, in my view, of kind of adapting to defeat by saying, no, we've actually advanced in terms of a better understanding of all sorts of things, not even just how to make a revolution, but what Marxism, like, successfully and then organizing socialism would look like. Right? In other words, Lenin has laid the blocks, and then it just opens up, well, Lenin laid the bricks, and Stalin built upon that, and then Mao builds upon it, and then you can get 500 varieties of whatever next strand you want. Well, I like this one, but I didn't like this country, and I sign with them. So what I'm trying to raise here is that even Lenin himself, to always be a Marxist, was to critique Marxism, which really just is Marxism. It just means, I hate to put it at be dialectical, because that also is not helpful, but it meant to be dialectical about the Marxist dialectic, about the dialectic itself. And so, in terms of Kautsky then, one of my favorite things that Lenin says in the Renegade Kautsky later, and of course this is part of the later 20th century, and we know the whole joke of somebody thought Karl Kautsky's first name was Renegade, right, and because of Lenin or something. But in the chapter on what is internationalism, Lenin says, how do I know what I did was right? Right? And he says, we might be crushed by world imperialism. He says right there, isn't to be correct is to succeed and everything? And he goes, I know what I did was right because we showed there was a third opportunity that was not social chauvinism, or I think they would call it imperialist pacifism. In other words, pacifism is a way of adapting to imperialism. because we showed that there was an opportunity of transforming the missed revolution into class war, actually fulfilling the ends of socialism. And he'll say, he says this in multiple occasions, from Latin, the proletariat has been translated to the languages of all the world, a dictatorship of the proletariat. People have identified with the Soviets. And Lenin will even say, I know this is right because Karl Kautsky, then the USPD is adopting some kind of program where now they're saying, yes, all power to the councils. Like, in other words, they can't fight the objective reality that this is spreading. So this is a way in which Lenin would fight with Kautsky, of other ways as well. You also brought up Luxembourg, so I'm wondering if you had this idea of Luxemburgism versus Leninism, which is like a problematic thing.
I was more referring to the critique of the Second International radicals. Could you also mention or talk about sort of the Marxism versus the Leninism, specifically, perhaps you already did with Kautsky, but for example, in the New Left, there is a return to Marx moment, there is a rejection of Leninism as vulgar and a desire to return to pure theory.
So hopefully this will satisfy, because I'm seeing the different possible paths that this speech dialogue could go down right now, and I'm trying to choose the most effective one. Okay, I was walking around Hyde Park the other day, and I was thinking to myself about, you mentioned the New Left, a Monty Johnston article called Marx and Engels on the Party. And I was kind of reflecting on it as, because the easy thing would maybe be Moshe Postone and, we have to reject traditional Marxism. But Lenin everywhere is saying it's not about distribution, the point is to abolish the proletariat. It takes me 2 seconds to prove this. And yet I understand why it maybe looked like that in the 60s. But to get at it from another angle, people would talk about what did the party mean to Marx and Engels, and the party as kind of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat and also the memory of 1848. And so that would be used in that context. It's kind of critiquing official Leninism, even though obviously to me it's a very Lenin thing. And you had even mentioned earlier Karl Kautsky saying, well, Luxemburg and Lenin, you care about the young Marx and not the mature Marx, whereas they're focused on the memory of 1848 and also what it means to return to that. So even when people would talk about Marx in a more political sense in the 60s, at least in this essay, to me it was still getting at Lenin, even though it was critiquing what they saw as Leninism, like the party form. In other words, Lenin would never say simply, there is a party here, it's good. This is another way that it gets translated, that Lenin solves the problem with the party, whereas as I try to talk about regarding the Second Congress, Lenin knew going into it that the party is actually going to allow us to deal with the inevitable problems that will show up. So I still don't know if that's the most satisfactory answer. I could bring up other things.
I am
as well.
satisfied.
Okay, okay, that's great. I guess I'll give another example as well, the national question, because this is always a thing as well. So, and this will also talk about Marxism. So post-1905, in Lenin's, Lenin starts talking about the national question more post-1905, because as he says, and we know from the history, a lot of national self-determination movements kind of spring up as a function of 1905. And when Lenin is polemicizing with Rosa Luxemburg is relying on the experience of 1848 and saying, well, look, didn't forms of Pan-Slavism put down the Vienna Republic? Haven't we learned that nationalism can be reactionary, it can be conservative? And Lenin's response basically, and this is the whole theory of imperialism, which now means everything and anything, anything, it seems to be imperialism today. The whole point of imperialism is that what has changed since Marx and Engels' time is the development of Marxism, right? So you can think of when Marx mentions imperialism, he says, it's that the proletariat cannot yet rule and the bourgeoisie can no longer rule, right? It's right out of the Paris Commune. The very development of the Second International is not overcoming that problem. It's only raising the necessity. And so consequently, the imperialist epoch is not that early capitalism was about commodities and now we have banks or something they were invented, but rather the way in which capitalism is transformed through the Marxist movement. So the national question changes. I have some quote there, I'm not going to read anything anymore, where Lenin just says, look, imperialism has created national oppression in a new way that has never been so previously. And you can read it in the Imperialism pamphlet. He says, even modern imperialism is different than imperialism of Marx's time. It's why Lenin points out how Marx and Engels kind of changed their view, right? Like they have some kind of view regarding the Italian wars and regarding 1848, and then Marx starts to talk about the oppression of the Irish, and that's like kind of reflecting the beginning of the change. But not only that, the whole point for Lenin is that the Marxists are driving the national question. Yes, there are non-Marxists at the head of various national self-determination, but there's a lot of proletariat, there's a lot of workers. And for Lenin, it's like, we have to take responsibility for how we change the world. Because of course, for the national question, he'll say, well, we're not going to support reactionary classes. He'll use an example of, he likes to use the example of Norway seceding from Sweden. Because he's like, that was led by the proletariat. And so he's saying, we are organizing the proletariat. They're making these demands. We have to take responsibility for them. And so what it means then is that as these symptoms show up, they could just be a way of adapting back into capitalism. Of course it could be. You could have a bourgeois revolution. Guess what? New place to invest capital in. Right? You could be on the stock market the next day. Okay, so what would it mean to make good on the kind of organization that was going into the self-determination movements? As Lenin says, it's especially a negative demand. It's against national oppression. We're going to build an internationalist culture that grabs from the democracy, the democratic culture of every nation, and not the bourgeois culture. Lenin talks about the way in which the proletarian standpoint on the national question is impractical. Right? He says this in The Right of Self-Determination of Nations in 1914. Why would it be impractical? It's too democratic. Not too democratic in the nation. It's too democratic because if you're consistently democratic, then the workers in the oppressed countries have rights to the capital in the oppressor countries. And ready for this? The workers in the oppressor countries also have the rights to the capital in the oppressed countries. That's if you're consistently democratic. In other words, democracy is an expression of the socialization of production. And so if you're consistent, it actually starts to look kind of odd from a bourgeois standpoint. It like breaks down, it bursts the integument, to quote Marx out of Capital, of the political system of bourgeois right. And yet the whole point, you know, Lenin has like this little note that's in like Lenin's collected works 115 or something like that, where he says the whole point is to fuse all the nations together. So of course it looks impractical from a national perspective because it's not really about forming nations. It's not really about a League of Nations, right? In other words, you're overcoming the national form actually through the self-determination. And that question has been put there because Marxism growing has organized the workers to start pressing their democratic rights. Of course, obviously, this takes on a different meaning than in the 20th century. And it even becomes like the formula. It's the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. That's one slogan. I'm not speaking really fast. And that's the way to get a revolution and socialism in one country. And it's the national question. You align with your progressive bourgeoisie. No, something like that, yeah. So that's another way in which all of these things, whereas like the whole point behind it, and also who was even responsible for raising the question in the first place, that's kind of dropped out. So there's another additional point. Yeah, somebody.
I'd like. Okay. So this weekend we had the 100th anniversary of Lenin's death, and we attended the IMT's event to commemorate that in London. And the IMT's attempt to capitalize on this anniversary is to rebrand itself in Britain as Revolutionary Communist Party, I think. And we spent 2 hours listening to being proselytized to really about Lenin's popularity with young people and his acute relevance today and how this can be used to inspire struggle. Which kind of this experience made me think that, and reminded me of the fact that Platypus itself is a project that's based on political assessment in its essence, right? political assessment of the fact that it's impossible to organize for socialism today, that a positive project is completely is just unfeasible or extremely unlikely to work out because of undissolved ideological obstacles. Or to put it differently, that there is no possible progressive reified form that we could work through to achieve socialism and dictatorship of proletariat. And really, to get there and to be able to have such a project would require us to be able to have, or to become, so to say, a self-conscious subject that is capable of acting and of consciously changing the course of history. And it seems from those experiences of completely amnesiac left that's seemingly losing what Lenin was capable of. So is unable to remember and is unable to act accordingly and to think through what's happening. Through those experiences, it just struck me as a hypothesis, which we were, I think, aware in Platypus, that perhaps there is perhaps regression, or so to say disintegration of the subject had gone too far to be able to actually create a Leninist party, right? To do what Lenin has done. That in a certain way, humanity is becoming brain dead. Like it's falling below those levels of consciousness that were achieved previously. And do you think that this assessment of, or do you think that do you think to which extent is reaching Lenin's? Do you think that there are any reasons to think that it actually is not a matter of disintegration of the subject as such, but rather of impossibility to just unresolved obstacles that need to be worked through, rather than kind of essential disintegration or changing character of humanity, beyond being this kind of post-bourgeois subject that we
So this actually kind of goes back to Andreas's question about like Platypus. In other words, to me, we're still thinking, and we're the hope would be actually in us, in you even reflecting on it right now, and even as I was asked earlier, Danny, why are you in Platypus? That itself would mean there's still a kind of possibility of reflecting on the fragments in some kind of manner, and that it's not like we're just done, game over kind of thing like that. Now for me, I always feel like I get a little optimism out of doing this teach-in as well as the Das Kapital one, because actually what I'm saying is that you don't have to treat this like it's some fixed theory. In other words, I'm talking about the conditions under which that critique could happen. On the one hand, people feel all the weight of perhaps what's missing, right? Like in other words, when I've done the Das Kapital one, people have been like, oh, it was a critique of the proletarian socialist movement that politicized Adam Smith. And then they kind of say, well, what exists like that today? And in fact, that dialogue is the exact one that I had to myself many years ago before I joined Platypus, meaning I had set myself the task of writing Das Kapital Part 2. That I was going to do it. I was going to figure out how to form this new subject. And kind of reaching that limit is actually what, in a lot of ways, led me to saying, this is a kind of question that must be answered first. And in a way, with Lenin, it's maybe even more of a deep problem. Because then, in a sense, the critique of political economy, what it's given rise to, he's pursuing the critique of that. Right? Like Marxism, scientific socialism. It's going to be self-conscious of it. Now, the reason I bring up then the optimism aspect is that in saying, what were these things that kind of gave rise to it, I'm trying to say it's not like this theory or nothing. I'm trying to say you, on the one hand, feel the weight of perhaps what's missing, but also perhaps that would lead people to be more open to possibilities. Instead of like even having to talk about, maybe if future politics is not going to say proletariat and surplus value. I'm totally fine with that. Does anybody object that it has to? Okay, there you go. right? And it's not like that was like some solidified form. That was a way in which a contradiction manifested itself. And so for me, the optimism is then that could people reflect on why they were drawn to these things? And there's probably a lot of reasons. There's also always emotional and social, cultural reasons as well. And feel free to think about politics in a more open way. Because if someone was to ask me, like, I know there are some members of Platypus who you were mentioning certain kinds of activism, and they would have more experience with that, and I know we're going to hear from them this weekend, that they might be able to reflect more on those obstacles. Even in basic activism, they would feel some kind of ideological obstacle. For me, like, my next step is always very general, just thinking about politics in general. And I feel like even basic things about what people think about left and right are like very received and very pigeonholing and very definite. And I'm not just saying the cliche thing of like, be open-minded and let me start a magazine that this is a new left or something, but actually to just kind of think about it without feeling like one has to act on it instantly. Because again, you know, I think this is what was picked up in the crowd when I'm talking about Marxism, Leninism, and Leninism, is that people, something happens in the news and they apply Lenin to it. They apply Lenin's words to it. And of course, there's tons of Lenin quotes of him saying to younger people, you've taken my words and put them in cans and then throw them and you don't know what you're saying, right? He has this, post-1905, he's saying all these people received Marxism and they like say it and they don't know why they're saying it, right? So I know I'm like looking at, you're still not satisfied with what I'm saying, but it's, to me, I guess I would not be here if I just was like, I totally give up on it. There's no point. I flew from Philadelphia, I'd be like, you know, like, all right, there's no point, you know. Yeah. I'm always very skeptical of this, like there's a permanent disintegration of the bourgeois subject, whatever that means. Because, you know, there's still bourgeois social relations. People still have jobs. That for Marx, that was enough to give rise to all these things. It's maybe more difficult in the sense that, yeah, now we have Marxism, and Marxism can sometimes be the greatest obstacle to Marxism.
Sure, but Marx was closer to the kind of original,
yes.
Uncontradicted bourgeois subject.
Yeah, this is the regression repetition thing. Meaning what would be implied in that is that in a way we've played out the Iskra split again and again and again and don't even recognize that it's the Iskra split anymore. And yet young people still, like, here's the other side of it. I just was railing against, like, oh, people will reach for Lenin. And yet that actually implies that there's still something continuous with their time, even when people maybe reach for Marx or Lenin in the most distorted fashion. Right, like me. Here, I'll just use myself as, like, I was like, oh yeah, Marx explained why the financial crisis happened. And now I reflect on it and I'm like, well, you were necessarily receiving Marx in some way. There's nothing special about me that I was able to do that. So I think plenty of people can do that. I think they can say, well, why is it that what does Marx and Lenin mean to me? And not in a personal sense, but they can think about all of the things that went into how Lenin seems to speak to them. I think you mentioned social democracy and communism, like those phrases. You were talking about the IMT? Yeah. Okay, so, all right, so why does Lenin change to the term communism? It's simply to distinguish himself from the Social Democrats at the time during World War I. He says the name was like soiled, basically, like as if you get your shirt dirty. But of course today, that's taken as like a militant perspective. To be like, if you're a social democrat, you're serious. If you're a communist, you're really serious. Like it's taken as an adverb on top of it. And, you know, because you're saying it right now, and yet I feel like, let's see, so I was in the United States. After AOC and various DSA people were elected into local offices and became senators, and then people in the DSA became upset with them, then they became communist. Like now I'm a communist, and AOC is a social democrat, right? So I've seen it play out before, and I'm sure if I go and ask my dad, he'll say, yeah, I saw the same thing. So we know where that comes from and then how it's received. Do you want to say more? Okay. Okay. Maybe a new question. You've had your hand up for some time, yeah.
Take my power in that respect. Do you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, so I found it really interesting your point about the relationship of Lenin to the Narodniks. So just to check if I understood you correctly before I ask my question. So you said, okay, Lenin recognized that there was this, so to say, demand that the Narodniks were making, that this was an immature demand, but still a demand that was symptomatic of capitalism and, so to speak, in some sense legitimate. And thus he also said, okay, we have to kind of integrate that, we have to run with it, we don't have to we can't just reject it completely at a time. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah. In other words, socialism is a symptom of capitalism. And the reason I said, he has a subtitle of one of his books, Our Native Sysmondies, meaning the socialism is a demand for bourgeois society, right? They're demanding that, from each according to their need, each according to their ability, they're demanding bourgeois rights. Like socialism for Marx was the problem, and in pursuing that, as he puts it in a letter in 1843, we would see that this is not the work of a new world, but the work of the old world. Meaning we would actually get down to the repetition of the problem. So yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So I'm interested now. So after the fall of the Soviet Union and so to speak, during the emergence of various revolutionary movements, which didn't explicitly use Marxist ideology it did at least use Marxist ideology, but not to the level of maybe some communist parties and etc. As previously known. So here I mean the Rojava Revolution and the Zapatistas and etc. So and also a different thing, so to speak, in ex-communist countries, so Eastern Europe and etc. We have an emergence, I think, which is very interesting, of a sort of conservative socialism that, for example, from an ex-communist country, most people that are communists are conservative people. So they are also nationalists. They're also have other, traits of anti-progressive ideologies in them, and etc. So I think, and also, so to speak, capitalism also, this is also a contradiction that I think it faces, and it is a border that, so to say, it has to face this sort of fracturing, of different ideologies and etc., which has allowed revolutionary thought to exist in these ways as well. So I think my question, I'm sorry if it's taking so long, is does, I think, Marxism also have to recognize a sort of atemporal dimension to this, so that it's not, so to speak, just linear, capitalism is introduced and then it has to face, different dimensions to it, but it's also, we have to take all of this into account. History cannot be linear in this respect, and it has to accommodate for all of these perspectives in order to be revolutionary.
Right, so was that then your question?
It, sorry.
Okay, no, that's great. So I begun talking about, Lenin says to simply close one's eyes to new things is totally unscientific. So it wasn't like Marx said it and that's the end. So of course one would have to take into account any new thing. It's why even, I'm going to digress for 1 second, I'll come back to your question. There's this whole Marxist economist thing, like labor theory of value versus marginal utility. To me, that's an un-Marxist way of dealing with it. Because you would have to treat even these new things as expressions or symptoms of capitalism. Like, in other words, what gives rise to their necessity? Why does it seem to make sense? Okay, coming back to your point then, I think as well that what was of interest to Marx about the proletariat, so this was another thing I was thinking about walking around Hyde Park yesterday, because I kind of tried to say, how would I talk about Marx if I couldn't say proletariat or surplus value or any of these things that are associated with Marx? And there's even a way in which this is dramatized in the movie Young Karl Marx, where I think it's Engels walking with like Jenny Marx, and they're kind of saying, well, there's this problem, and the question is, who is going to take up the problem? And I would add a little bit more, in other words, who is going to give form to the problem? Meaning what first stands out for Marx about the proletariat is that it's literally the objectification of the dissolution of society. So to me, it's not really about like, are they workers in some straightforward sense? Because I think that's what you're kind of raising by saying, well, what about these other things that have existed post-Soviet Union, or even that people who call themselves communists might have what would be called conservative cultural values today, in which I would still say someone should consider why that's the case relative to so-called progressive cultural values, meaning what about capitalism? What about emancipation are they expressing as well? Right? Like, in other words, we can't just say, oh, it's a conservative cultural value. But the reason I bring that up is that it's not about, to me, like, that was the image of the proletariat, let's try to get it again, because I think, you know what salting is?
Can you repeat?
So maybe it's I don't think it's an American thing. I think people talk about, salting is like, oh, I'm a worker, I'm a socialist, I'm gonna go get a job at a factory, or in America, it's very popular at Starbucks and Einstein Bagels, and I'm gonna try to unionize. I mean, I can't find the workers, so I'm gonna go and be it myself and kind of solve that problem. And to me, the question still there is that they're trying to kind of put the pieces back together rather than considering why was that piece considered the lever in the first place. And so again, to me, I try to be open about the fact that maybe a reconstituted left, this is a kind of objective of Platypus, it could look different, because maybe the left today is like a platypus, and it's not like a nice, I don't know what a nice looking animal would be. A bear, a nice, furry bear, and we're all comfortable with what kind of animal that is, and it's not like a combination of animals. That I'm trying to say it might look in a different way, and even the term proletariat is a contradictory phrase, right? A citizen without property is expressing the crisis of bourgeois society, because you can't be a citizen without property. Well, what is the first property in bourgeois society? It's labor. And so we're having people seek to try to solve a problem in civil society politically. They're expressing a self-contradiction. And so again, this like kind of thought I was having in my head walking around Hyde Park yesterday is, what about returning to the basic question of what politics would mean, of what it would mean to organize something that could take up that kind of problem? Instead, and I think this goes back to a question that was asked earlier about the New Left, people had an image of the proletariat as like an oppressed sociological group. And then when we get in the 20th century is, well, there's all these other oppressed sociological groups. So let's try them. And let's try this one over here. We'll try this one over here. But then there's an economic crisis and we're back to the workers. Rather than thinking about what did it mean to them and why for them they thought that was the way to overcome the problem in the present. I feel like actually, and this might be controversial in a lot of ways, Marx's basic demand has not actually been tried, really. Lenin tried to set off the opportunity to really try it, but it hasn't. I don't know if that makes contact with your question. It seemed to be asking about, aren't there these other things, like post-Soviet Union, you mentioned the Zaptistas. I don't know, did you want to respond more if I was missing the question?
No, it's more or less fine. I mean, that's the general kind of trajectory I was going into, that it seems to me necessary for us to accommodate for different types of sort of historical developments, different types of even property and etc. and how do we relate to it. I mean, I remember Marcos, so Subcadante Marcos was like in his, I don't remember which context it was about, but he said, I went over to the people in Chiapas and talked to them about property, and they just couldn't accept it that way. That's simply not the way that they related to the world. But they still could be a revolutionary class, or could they? I mean, that's kind of, I think, the whole question.
I feel like I start at a more basic question, which is instead of first asking who are the revolutionary group, I'm like, what do we even mean by politics? Or what even problem are we dealing with? and it's the same with like, people are taught Marxism through Lenin now, who, as I tried to prove, is actually giving a critique of Marxism. It's the same way in which people learn economics through Das Kapital, and they don't even know he's critiquing the very categories he's using. So you get this whole confused reception. So the reason I bring that up is that rather than this question of like, oh, what about this group or that group, I'm like 101 basic questions now. And maybe I'm like really left behind and people know a way better answer, and I'd be happy to be wrong even, like if I was totally shown up on this. But I just am thinking about like, what is society? What are we talking about? What is the problem that ostensibly is there? What would it mean to even engage with that problem? What are we talking about? And that's why that would be the optimism about even returning to these questions, is we could think about how, you know, it's like, it's almost like trying to do the 104 class before the 101 class. Like it's trying to do the fancy thing. In other words, Marx comes to the class thing, he doesn't start with that. He actually kind of comes to it as manifesting the problem.
Yeah, that's kind of what I also implicitly meant. I mean, that we have to rethink it, that we have to rethink even the concepts there of society.
Can I say something simpler? Even the rethinking thing. Also, just think about how things are like received right now, because the rethinking thing can actually get into that kind of like progressivism view of history of like, oh, we're just always rethinking things. There's been like generations of rethinking. It's a fun, sexy thing. Like, oh, we're going to rethink this the 100th time. And I'm just like, how have we received all of this and why?
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to go back to something you said earlier. Platypus, you said that essentially in Lenin's text he writes that the goal is to abolish the proletariat. But even if that's true, isn't perhaps Lenin getting ahead of himself? That when the Bolsheviks came to power, I mean, the industrial proletariat only really constituted about less than 3% of the population. So the goal of the Soviet state was really to constitute that proletariat. In a sense, the state constitutes a national capital, right? This is Posthuman's position. Yeah. So I'm just saying, perhaps in objective historical terms, Lenin didn't understand his role, in a sense.
I mean, so I was going to read like a little section of Lenin saying, do not fetishize literally anything I have done or said. So for Lenin, the phrase new economic policy was, quote, a strange title because it turned things back. They were going back, but to take a running start and make a bigger leap forward. State capitalism, as early as 1918, was understood as a possible line of retreat because of the slow development of the revolution in the West. Lenin's fear was that the Soviets would adapt to the defeat of the revolution. They had tried to go up the mountain one way, found it blocked, and had to turn around. So this is one of Lenin's last public appearances at the All Russia Congress of Transport Workers. They had a placard out in front that said, "The reign of the workers and peasants will last forever." And Lenin's like, no, that's not good. That is not good. And he says, indeed, if the reign of the workers and peasants would last forever, we should never have socialism, for it implies the abolition of classes. And as long as there are workers and peasants, there will be different classes, and therefore no full socialism. Like he's clear. He's not like, oh yeah, this is socialism. He's like very clear about it. I'll keep continuing. Lenin's left-wing communism was, in one sense, a summation of the kinds of experiences that new communist sections of the Third International would have to fight to learn. So I skipped a long quote of Lenin basically saying, in 1914 in April, we've gone through this experience of producing new opportunisms, and we've had to learn how to fight with them. And that's what's going to repeat. It's not necessarily that you're going to have a peasant revolution or workers' revolution, but you're going to actually have to learn to deal with internal problems that will necessarily come out. So even with respect to Lenin's famous slogan of revolutionary defeatism, he felt by the end of his life that this was becoming a mere catchphrase. He thought it was erroneous to just think that you could teach the masses that the danger of war could be averted by threatening a strike or revolution. What was left out was the whole experience. After all, the Basel Congress had provided the, quote, theoretical admission that war is criminal, that socialists cannot condone war, etc., and yet this turned out to be an empty phrase. By the, quote, very nature of modern wars in general, the question of the defense of the fatherland will inevitably arise, and the overwhelming majority of the working people inevitably decide in favor of the bourgeoisie. The Marxists would actually have to prepare for the way in which it would be a crisis. So that's from December 1922. It was a note that he gave to the Hague Congress. So, I mean, in terms of how he objectively played, then you're starting to say, well, maybe Lenin didn't mean it, but people abused him later. But people abused Marx in Lenin's time. And so this goes to the question of regression. In a sense, Marx was used as the counter-revolution, and Lenin turned that into the basis for making the revolution. Right? He turned in the high expression of capitalism was in Marxism itself. If that later happened with Lenin, and someone was not able to follow through on the potential that that expressed, then I think one can fairly say then we actually have regressed from the kind of level of theory and praxis that Lenin was able to raise at that point. I mean, maybe that's not a fun conclusion, but to me it's like, again, it's not like I can take Lenin's words and explain the world around me in a simple description, but I can at least say, you know, have we actually achieved the same kind of level of the necessity and the depth of the crisis? I don't think so. But I don't know if that quite answered your question. Lenin knows the point is to abolish labor. He knows all of that. He says it against the Narodniks in like 1894. Yeah. Okay. That's why Marxism's a thing. It's because the proletariat's self-contradictory. If it was just like a straight line, why would you ever need some guy to be like, hey, have you guys read Hegel and give a critique? The whole point of Das Kapital is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin says that to Kautsky in 1919. Karl Kautsky was the editor of volumes 2 through 4. He's saying, you were a Philistine who doesn't know the book you edited, and there's a correspondence of you back and forth with Engels. And of course, Kautsky knows it, but like doesn't want to know it at the time. So I'm just saying that because, like, of course, the reason there is the critique of political economy is because it's embodying the self-contradiction of the proletariat. That yes, you are constituting yourself to abolish yourself. And that's why there would ever need to be Marxism, ever scientific socialism.
Okay. Oopsie. Noch eine Frage? Okay, so trying to get, I'm over here to your left. Yeah. No, here left.
Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry, I got blindsided.
Trying to get at your overall point again. Would you agree that what you're basically trying to be saying is that Lenin tried to keep Marxism from being a religion, to uphold a certain, whatever you want to call it, vital or dialectical relation of theory and practice? And second little question would be, what would you say then to the famous Lenin quote that Marxism is almighty because it's true? What would you say did he mean by that? And isn't by, for example, saying a quote like that or something like that partially, like isn't Lenin also partially at fault that Marxism is treated that way, but if he says something like that? Yeah.
Well, is this on? Yeah, I think I quoted that at the beginning, right? It's from, I think it's the Encyclopedia, Karl Marx. It's either that or it's 3 Components of Marxism. It's one of those 2 biographical ones where he's like, it's omnipotent because it's true. That's at least the translation I know in. This is what you're referring to?
I don't know where he says it. I don't know.
But,
I only know the quote.
Okay, 3 minutes. Okay, so I'll be very quick. Okay, but again, you know, I'm the reason I brought up what Lenin says, like in that section of my presentation, is he knows that Marxism is a symptom of capitalism. So it's not simply like it's omnipotent because it's true, it is the word, and it's the final reality. It's a historically specific reality. And what makes it true, and I think this was a question I had received in the back, is actually, in a sense, it's being produced by a contradiction, and therefore it's being received in a contradictory form. And so, yes, I guess one could be liable to opportunism if you just turn it into, therefore, religion, like some immediate thing. But for Lenin, all of the truths of Marxism had to be arrived at. And let me see if I don't know if I can find it. I'm not going to find it in the 30 pages right now. The Tasks of the Youth Leagues, right? It's a 1901 article. He just talks about, yeah, you know, the Marxist thing that in the final analysis, class determines your politics. He says, but that has to be achieved. You arrive at that through struggle. Meaning it's not this like PMC thing today where it's like, your job is this and that's why that's your politics. And so to say, therefore, it's true, it's a task to become true, to be made true, to raise the necessity. Because in a sense, even raising the explicitness of the contradiction is an act it's an activity. One makes it so. Otherwise, in a sense, it's just kind of accident, right? This is why, you know, the Neurodniks, their early view of capitalism was kind of like accidents. And actually, the success of Marxism is raising the necessity. It's actually driving the class struggle. It's making the contradiction more explicit. It's making it more into an object. Okay. Yeah, the proletariat's a dialectical object. Its self-consciousness is simultaneously producing it as an object. So, I mean, in terms of like, can Marxism become a religion? Yes, I guess, sure. I'm not trying to dismiss the question, but it's, maybe you wanted to say, I guess we don't have much. Say something more, I don't want to cut you off. I mean, is he liable to say that? Well, I guess, sure. But it's really not his responsibility. It's our fault that we've turned it into, well, Lenin said so. You know, and that's why even when I've tried to quote Lenin into oblivion right here, I've tried to say, well, why was he saying this? Instead of just, he said it and that's why it's true. Same with Marx, I guess. Any other? I think we're at time, actually. Not that I want to cut it, yeah. So, stand in silence.
Thank you.